Good afternoon, and on behalf of Bryant's Alumni Association, welcome to our first webinar of 2019, designed to share professional expertise with members of the Bryant community. My name is Sade Hunt-Jante, class of 2017, and I work in the Office of Alumni and Parent Engagement. Today you will hear from Michael Roberto, a best-selling author and trustee professor of management at Bryant University. Our webinar will be moderated by Justin Andrews, creative strategist, Bryant alumnus, and professional video marketer. Before we start, let's establish the structure of today's webinar, which will last for 1 hour. All participants are in listen-only mode. However, we encourage you to comment, respond to polls, and ask questions using the question and answer feature located in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. We'll answer questions both during and at the end of the webinar. After today's presentation, you will receive a survey. Please take a moment to provide feedback. Your comments are valuable as we expand our professional development programs. Now, I will turn the program over to Justin Andrews, class of 2010, a co-founder of Animus Studios, a creative agency that helps brands find their fascinating and share it with the power of video. In this role, he often sees the pains and gains of relating to unlocking creativity. Take it away, Justin.
Thanks, Sade, and welcome everybody. It's really exciting to be here because it's an awesome topic with a professor that I really enjoyed learning from at Bryant. So Mike Roberto is trustee professor of management at Bryant University, and he's released his third book, Unlocking Creativity. I have it right here. It's an awesome book. My role is really just to listen to the audience today and try to capture your questions and kind of make it feel like you're in the classroom, something that I really loved at Bryant with Michael. So with no further ado, Michael, kick it off and let's learn how to unlock creativity.
Thanks, Justin, and thanks, Sade. I'm so glad to be doing this with you, Justin. It's a lot of fun to collaborate again. It was great to have you in the classroom a number of years ago. Hi, everybody. It's exciting to talk to a number of alumni about some of these ideas around unlocking creativity today. I wanted to start with a couple of stories about the resistance to new ideas, and perhaps motivate the topic of why we need to think about how to unlock or unleash creativity in our organizations. The two stories, the first goes back to the mid-19th century in France and to a painter named Manet. And he painted a number of interesting paintings that he hoped to get into the Salon in Paris, which was a major exposition of the great artists of the time. And this particular painting called Levin, or The Bath originally, later changed the name, was one of the masterpieces that he had been working on that he hoped to be able to get into the Salon. But unfortunately, it was rejected. He was bringing a very different kind of art to the scene. And he was, in fact, launching what later became known as the modernist movement. And he was really a mentor to the Impressionists who came along after him. But this was a scene that was shocking for a number of reasons. First of all, the style of painting was very much different than the traditionalists who reigned at the time. Also, the idea of this woman taking a bath, these people in this scene in the park, it was a sort of a scandalous picture, if you will. So both the content of the painting and the style of the painting really were shocking. And he and a number of others who were experimenting with different modes of art were being rejected. Now, interestingly, Emperor Napoleon at the time was concerned about social unrest, and so he actually came up with a notion of having a salon of the rejects at the time. And so people who could not get their paintings displayed in the annual salon were going to go to this other exposition. But even there, his paintings were mocked. Manet ridiculed by some who just didn't understand this very different kind of art, this very different style. It was rougher, cruder. It didn't have the kind of minute attention to detail that some of the nostalgic paintings of past battles and chivalrous actions did. Of course, we now know that he really was the father of a big shift, and eventually his innovations took hold. But there was incredible resistance to his new ideas for quite some time, as there was for the Impressionists, like Monet and others, when they first began to exhibit their paintings. Now, on the right on the screen, we have a picture of, now in the 1980s, two doctors in Australia who were studying what caused ulcers. And they weren't convinced that the conventional wisdom in the field of medicine was correct. At the time, the general belief among the public and the medical community was that stress caused ulcers. They came to believe that a particular strand of bacteria caused ulcers, and they were trying to convince the medical community of their findings. They presented their ideas at research conferences. They said it was as if they were telling people that the world was flat. No one believed them. Their ideas were dismissed readily. So frustrated, eventually they came up with an idea for how they might actually prove to all of these skeptics in the medical community that they were right. They extracted the particular strain of bacteria that they thought was causing ulcers from a sick patient. And then one of them ingested the bacterial strain, gave themselves an ulcer, documented the symptoms taking place, and then treated themselves with the antibiotic that they thought would cure this particular kind of bacterial infection. And indeed, they cured themselves. Doctors Marshall and Warren eventually won the Nobel Prize in Medicine, but only after doing something so dramatic to overcome the resistance to new ideas. This is a theme we see throughout history, whether it's in 19th century Paris or in Australia in the field of medicine, or even today with a lot of the innovators in a number of fields. So my first question to all of you, and you can perhaps type in a response to this question, and Justin will take a look and maybe interject if he hears a good story or two or a good idea or two here, is that why is there such resistance to new ideas in many of the organizations in which you work? What's the cause of this resistance to new ideas? If you want to chime in, I'll offer you one thought, which I believe is really important and we have to think about, and that is that experts in many fields can become very dogmatic over time. They can become very wedded to the conventional wisdom, very convinced of their own ideas and the rightfulness of those ideas. And therefore, they close their minds to new perspectives. And then, in fact, sometimes we benefit from adopting a beginner's mindset, where we're willing to question assumptions, not take things for granted, ask those challenging questions, and maybe wonder whether the conventional wisdom is correct. Unfortunately, in many cases, experts have great sway in organizations, and they do become dogmatic over time, and they don't ask the kind of questions that beginners ask, and thus there's resistance to new ideas. But I'm sure you have other ideas as well, and we'd love to hear from you.
And I posted it in the chat window, and you can also submit answers in the questions window, whatever works for you guys, and we'll field those and then answer what comes in.
Thanks, Justin. I think a second factor that contributes to this resistance to new ideas is that, in fact, there's a bit of double talk on creativity in many organizations. You might say it's a bias against creativity in a way. See, if you listen to what leaders say, they say things like, we want people who think outside the box. I love people who challenge the status quo. I want to hear from people with creative ideas. But those same leaders, what are they actually thinking? They're thinking, why can't he just accept the way we do things around here? She's quirky and unfocused. What an odd guy. He doesn't seem to fit our culture. In other words, it's not that leaders dislike creative people. It's that they're kind of ambivalent about them in a way, right? They would like to have more out-of-the-box thinkers in the organization. They'd like to have more innovation. But at the same time, these people often make them uncomfortable because they are challenging the status quo, because they are questioning underlying assumptions. Perhaps they're even questioning the strategy of the firm at times. And so there is this uncomfortable dynamic in organizations where leaders say the right things, but they're often thinking, those people with bold ideas, they're making me a bit uncomfortable. I'm not sure I'm okay with that. And of course, anytime people at lower levels begin to sense that discomfort, they may become reticent to share their ideas. And that's really problematic in many cases. Where does our ambivalence about creativity come from? I would argue that, we can all go all the way back to our elementary school classrooms. If you're a fan of the great the great book first by Roald Dahl, and then the great movie starring Danny DeVito, Matilda, you'll recognize the teacher, the very mean teacher there in the photo, and you see the students' duties in the back: sit straight, be quiet, pay attention. We say in the classroom, right, that we want to stimulate the intellectual curiosity of our students, right? That we want to encourage their creativity. We want them to think critically. All these wonderful things we say. But really what we often do is we press for conformity. We establish rules. We line them up at their desks, right? and we are very much driving for compliance. Now, I'm not suggesting that we don't want any compliance. We need some compliance. We need order in the classroom. We need some level of rule following. But in a way, we're actually sending a message sometimes to students, right? This message about compliance and conformity that's magnified, right, when they then get into organizations, especially large corporations, who, again, while they may talk about the desire for critical thinking and creativity, are really pressing for compliance and conformity. And in part, that's because executives are looking to drive execution. They've got a strategy, and what they really want is alignment and compliance so they can get execution. But what I heard one executive tell me as I was researching this topic is, today always gets in the way of tomorrow, meaning that the desire to execute today and to have all that compliance and conformity sometimes prevents us from coming up with the new ideas we'll need to compete and to succeed tomorrow. So this, I think, is the other element of the challenge and why we struggle at times and we resist new ideas in many organizations.
So,
Justin, did you hear anybody comment about why they think there's resistance to new ideas?
Yeah, I think this is a good one and one that we can all sort of resonate with. So this person submitted 3 things. One, that staying in the comfort zone is human, right? Like, that's where we like to be. We don't want to go outside and we don't want to feel uncomfortable. I know the book has some great stories about that, and maybe you can hit on those. And 2, new things have been tried, but they've failed. So then people don't want to try something new again. And lastly, this person said 3, when trying new things, it regularly is not given enough time to actually see if it's going to pan out. So those are 3 that have to do with leadership and the approach. What are your thoughts on those?
Well, I think those are 3 very powerful themes. They all came through in interviews that I conducted and in visits to a number of companies. I will say on the last one, there's no question. I think there's pressure on many people who have an original idea to say, how big is your idea? Is there a big market for that product or service? Can it move the needle? And then you put people in a really awkward spot when they've got this little germ of, this beginnings of an idea, right? It hasn't yet germinated fully. And you're asking them, is it a big idea? And if they overpromise and underdeliver, you kill it, right? And in fact, not only do you kill the project, but maybe that person's career gets imperiled because they, quote, failed, even though it may not have fully failed, right? But they got put in a position where in order to convince people to give them resources, they had to overpromise, and then they ran the risk of underdelivering. So I think so the last 2 points made about failure and about the idea that sometimes you don't get enough time to make it work, they go hand in hand in many ways. And I think the other piece, the first point, yeah, go ahead, Justin.
I'll hit on one more that's here because a lot of them, I know you just mentioned the first point again, so we'll stop there. A lot of them hit on that idea of the doublespeak, the culture, and human innate discomfort with getting outside of the box. And we say that is the most overutilized term ever, but it's not about getting outside of the box. It really is about unlocking the creativity within and being okay with it. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a little exercise that I stole from a legendary researcher at Stanford, Bob McKim, that I do now with a lot of audiences. And I do it with executive audiences. And here's the exercise. I give them 60 seconds. I ask them to turn to someone near them in whether it's a classroom, auditorium, a ballroom in a hotel, whatever it is where we're at. I give them some paper and a pen. I say, you've got 60 seconds to sketch the person next to you. And inevitably, and then 60 seconds goes up, and then I ask them to share the sketch, show the sketch to others at their table. Inevitably, the same thing happens. There's a lot of nervous laughter. There's a whole lot of apologizing for how bad the sketch is. There's a whole bunch of people who say, I'm just a terrible artist. There's a few people who literally refuse to show their sketch to their neighbor. They hide it, right? I just did this actually last week, and someone who I walked around the tables to look at the sketches, and this one woman crossed her arms, refused to even draw a sketch. She's like, I'm not a good artist. And just, I can understand that because frankly, I was petrified the first time I was asked to do that exercise. Petrified. I've done this with 10-year-olds, right? And Bob McKim did too. And 10-year-olds react completely differently, right? They embrace it. There's something about as we grow older, we get so worried about what others will think of our ideas that we self-censor. So we can blame it on leaders who squelch creativity and press for conformity. But I think also we have to think about our own behavior. Do we self-censor? Are we so worried about what others will think that we sometimes don't put our ideas out there? So Justin, I think you're right on the mark, or whoever commented on that is right on the mark about that.
Yeah, lots of great comments, and I wish we could get to them all, but just due to time, we should probably move on. Another person commented that as a 28-year-old in a room with a lot of senior males, typically, how to get your voice heard, even if it's a good idea and not get it bulldozed. So the book addresses a lot of those. And I do want to point out now, and we'll at the end, if you go to alumni.bryant.edu, Michael Roberto is speaking at a number of events throughout February and beyond, it looks like. So you can try to find him there and be able to connect at a personal level, I would assume. So why don't we
Yeah, we do alumni events in lots of cities: Chicago, Raleigh, Boston, New York. Yeah, really looking forward to meeting a bunch of alums again, seeing former students, and sharing more of these ideas. But I think if you're the 28-year-old, just to quickly comment on that, the answer is standing up in the middle of that room and trying to sell the entire room on your idea. That's a very difficult thing to do. And I think the ability to learn how to persuade and influence when you don't have authority is such an important skill. And often that begins with your ability to connect one-on-one with people outside of the meeting, to begin to persuade them. And ideally, it's about embracing a small win strategy that says, before I can sell them on the big idea, I've got to show them some small wins, build some credibility. And if I can do that, but you're not doing that in the middle of a big meeting with a whole bunch of people who are 20 years older than you and who have a lot more seniority, generally speaking. So that's just a quick comment on that.
Cool.
Justin, I know you asked me as we were thinking about preparing this webinar about why does this all matter? And I thought I'd share this chart because I think this is really at the heart of why this matters. This was an analysis done by Kraft Consulting Group where they looked at the Fortune 500 over a 3-year period. And it's pretty startling what they found is that nearly 40% of the Fortune 500 had experienced a revenue decline during that period, and that nearly half of the group was growing at single digits, many of them at low single digits. So you really only had about 80 companies that were growing at a fairly rapid clip, in the Fortune 500. So what you've got in many ways is what I call a growth crisis in large corporations, where they are searching desperately for the next big idea, the new idea. How do we recharge organic growth? Because as we know, growing by acquisitions can be so challenging, often value destroying in many companies. Yeah. Put another way, there's a phenomenal study by Nicholas Bloom that came out last year where he looked at research and development spending in the United States. And the findings here were remarkable. What they show is that we're still doing an incredible amount of innovation. And by the way, this doesn't just hold in the U.S. These kinds of data are being collected in other countries as well. What we're finding is, of course, in many industrialized developed nations, that we're getting a lot less bang for our buck when we spend on R&D than we used to. And so it's getting harder and harder to find new ideas. So put the growth crisis together with this, and we say creativity really matters. We really need to find a way to instill it. Justin, you were going to comment.
You see it evident with a lot of the companies within the last 10 years that have just boomed. Uber, Airbnb, Slack, these are companies that weren't built within R&D sectors of a company. These were, people tinkering in their garage and building explosive companies through creativity.
You got it. And, not all of those will succeed. There'll be a healthy dose of failure in there, including some of the ones you mentioned who may not in the end. Remember, we could go back to the mid-90s when the internet boom took place, and we could have named a whole bunch of hot companies who, 10 years later didn't exist anymore. Let's just take Netscape as a good example. The browser that started it all is nowhere to be seen today, right? So, but yes, there'll be a healthy dose of failure, but there's a whole bunch of people pioneering new ways of doing things too. So I guess the question is, what do we do about this, right? And one question you might ask is, do we need to hire more creative superstars? Is the answer to go find some superheroes to come in and bring innovation and creative ideas? In other words, are just some people more creative than others, and we need to go out and just find those people who are creative? And while I'm not denying that some people may have a healthy dose of natural creativity and maybe or at least feel more confident in their creativity than others, I don't think the answer generally is for companies to think that they can simply refine their human resource practices and attract the kind of talent that will help them be more creative and innovative. I think they have to look inside their own organizations and recognize that there's a heck of a lot of talent already there. And I heard this time and again from folks when I was out in organizations. that the answer isn't about necessarily finding more talent. It's about unleashing the talent you already have. And the question is, what's holding that talent back? And a lot of the common answers I heard were bureaucracy, hierarchy, the demand for quarterly financial targets being met. And those are not incorrect explanations, but I found those to be insufficient explanations. There was something else getting in the way beyond just the usual explanations about structure and hierarchy. In fact, because in a lot of smaller firms I studied, I found barriers to creativity. And I couldn't attribute it to bureaucracy and hierarchy. And some of them weren't public companies, so I couldn't attribute it to the Wall Street pressure either. What was going on? The conclusion I've come to is that it's really about mindsets. And I define mindsets, and I'm talking now not about simply personal mindsets, but organizational mindsets. These are belief systems that permeate organizations. They shape how people think, decide, and act with regard to the development of original ideas. And what I'm going to do today is share with you two of those mindsets that I think are standing in the way of creativity in many organizations. There are others that I talk about in the book, but I wanted, for the sake of time, to rather than skirt all six very quickly, to really dive into two of them in a little more depth with you today. The big idea here is that leaders don't need to generate more great ideas. In fact, it's not really the job of the leader to have all the great ideas. The job of the leader is to clear the path so that curious thinkers can experiment, learn, and discover. So it's about transforming these mindsets that get in the way.
So I'm in the creative services industry. We go to bigger companies, sometimes kind of boring businesses, and we have creative meetings and we have pre-production meetings around what is the best idea we can do for this campaign from a video standpoint. And it is amazing when you read the book and you see the mindsets, they all just stick out, right? Like you get used to seeing them now and you can kind of pinpoint examples and start really putting yourselves in the shoes of, well, what do we have to do differently to have this conversation and create comfort in this sort of uncomfortable hurdle to get people over? Because everyone's familiar with the naysayers and these mindsets. If you read the book, they just stick out. So it'll be interesting to hear about two of them today.
Yeah, let's dive in. And actually, the first one is kind of an interesting one because the story starts with a Bryant alum, believe it or not, a Bryant alum who I got to talk to named Bryant. Brian was out in LA in the 1990s. He was trained as an investment banker, and he was going out there to do a bunch of finance work with various kinds of media companies. And he met up with a guy named Mark Burnett, a former British paratrooper. And the two of them kind of came together to work on what was really one of the very first reality television shows. It was an adventure endurance race. The first one set out in Utah, where teams would compete in this incredible, difficult endurance race. It was called the Eco Challenge. And they got it aired on first on Discovery Channel, I believe, and then on ESPN and others. And it was fairly successful. And from there, Brian went on to become CEO of a company and was very successful. And Mark went on to develop a series of other reality television shows, the first of which was called Survivor. Now, Survivor is an interesting story because Mark Burnett, it turns out, had a very, very difficult time getting people to buy into this show. He pitched it to every major network. He pitched it to a number of minor networks, and everyone said no. And eventually, after repeated attempts, he actually was able to change the minds of some CBS executives. But they were only willing to put the show on in the summer of the year 2000. The summer was a time of reruns. There were really, at that point in time, 20 years ago, very few original shows were premiering in the summer. It was a wasteland for network TV. And but hey, he got it on television, so Mark said yes. And by the end of that summer, we were all watching, mesmerized by Richard Hatch running around naked on this island. And 51 million people watching the season finale in August of that year. Just to give you a
Richard
sense.
versus Rudy. Rudy was the second person. Richard versus Rudy.
Oh my gosh, yeah, Rudy was another one.
I had it on DVD when it finished. I literally bought this on DVD. It was the best because it was just a new thing. It was just so cool.
Crazy thing, right? It's hard to remember how shocking this was. And amazing, 51 million people. Just to give you a sense, this is like double the number of people who watched the season finale of the #1 comedy on television that year, which was Friends. So I mean, this is enormous popularity. So what happened next? Well, you wouldn't be shocked to know that over the next decade or so, the Washington Post reported that over 300 reality TV shows debuted. Now, a few of them were really successful and continue on the air today, like The Bachelor, for example. But there were a lot of them that were completely forgettable. I mean, completely forgettable. That flamed out in a matter of weeks, in fact. Right? But there was this incredible amount of copycat behavior as a result, right, of this one success. Now, it turns out that in Hollywood history, this kind of copycat behavior happens repeatedly. Let's go back to the 1960s. In 1964, there were this is kind of hard to believe, there were virtually no cop shows, no police dramas on broadcast network television. At that time, 3 major networks, CBS, ABC, and NBC. Just 1% of the network primetime schedule. Westerns, variety shows were dominant, and of course, comedies. And then in the late 1960s, a few new police dramas appeared, and they were rating hits. One of them was Ironsides, another was Hawaii Five-0, the original Hawaii Five-0. And what happened in the years that followed? In just 6 or 7 years, police dramas accounted for nearly 30% of the broadcast network television schedule. Copycats galore. It was incredible. And then in 1977, a show premiered about a sleazy oil tycoon and his totally dysfunctional family in Texas. And the story of J.R. Ewing captured the imagination of the nation. And then all of a sudden, a whole bunch of copycats emerged there. And the fall of the police drama, not all the way back down to 1%, but far fewer police dramas. And then in the early 1980s came a series of private detective shows and partner cop shows like Magnum PI, Simon & Simon, Cagney and Lacey. And the police drama shot up again with lots of copycats. So time and again, intelligent history. And yet, research shows that originality does much better than imitation when it comes to TV ratings, by a wide margin, in fact. And yet, we see this constant copycat behavior. You know, Gary Hamel, the great strategy writer, once said, strategies converge because success recipes get lavishly imitated. And in the humorous quote, he said, aiding and abetting strategy convergence is an ever-growing army of eager young consultants transferring best practice from leaders to laggards. Right? We see this incredible convergence, this herd behavior, if you will, following the herd, industry after industry. If anybody has any examples, I'd love for you to type them in, and Justin will maybe share a few of those examples you have of strategy convergence, of industries where companies have gotten more and more alike, unfortunately, over time. And as a result, competition intensified and profits fell. So if you have an example of that where industries got kind of bland and monolithic, I'd love to hear them.
And even just the industry I'm in. So 7 years ago, we started a video production company. And that was when DSLR cameras, these smaller cameras, started coming out. And it felt novel at the time, but now 7 years later, we've had to keep reinventing ourselves because what we were doing 7 years ago, barriers to entry were low. Everyone started doing the same thing. There are so many Me Too companies out there, and it's tough to carve your niche and keep making it happen. So yeah, submit questions. We got a ton of questions on last time. Hopefully we can get through a few of them again.
Yeah, I'd love to hear them, and examples are always great. So if you have an example of where you see this, love to hear it.
So
I want to show you an analysis here. Yeah.
We have one already that might be good to answer before jumping into this is, how do you justify it breaking away from the herd in situations like this? How do you justify it to leadership, or if you are leadership, how do you say, yeah, we should not follow them, we should do something completely different? Seems
Perfect.
really risky.
Let's go right to this chart because I think it addresses that question, Justin. So what I think is at the heart of why we have so much herd behavior is actually benchmarking. And this is the first mindset. The benchmarking mindset, I would argue, benchmarking is a bit of a curse in organizations. It can be incredibly helpful. Obviously, we have to study the competition. But unfortunately, I think in far too many cases, benchmarking leads to copying rather than learning and adaptation. When we benchmark, what we really should be doing is learning from our competitors, but still developing original strategies, distinctive strategies that let us stand out. But instead, what you end up with is herd behavior. So benchmarking, while helpful at times, can be a bit of a curse. So let me explain the benchmarking mindset. Suppose you did this benchmarking analysis. You analyzed your product or service along 4 dimensions, right? A, B, C, and D. And you evaluated how well you were doing relative to the competition. And you're the yellow bar, and your competitor is the red bar in this chart. Okay? So what you can see here is that on attributes B and D, you're pretty alike. your competitor, you and your competitor rate about the same. But you see on A and C, there's a big difference between you and your competitor. How do you think most executive teams respond when they see this analysis? Remember, you're the red bar, your competitor is the yellow bar. How do you think most executive teams respond to this benchmarking analysis? What do they want to do? If you could type it in, that'd be great.
And someone pointed out something interesting, that all the shows you cited as being those big hits have all been rebooted in the last 5 years.
It's amazing. It's so true. Hawaii Five-0 being, the prime example. Yeah, totally true.
And then we have another one which is related to the insurance industry. So the products themselves, so many of them are similar, minimal differences between them. This has made the industry ripe for small company disrupting the industry.
And we're seeing that a little bit in the insurance business, actually, right? There are some disruptors that have emerged. So that's a very good example.
Yeah.
Did anybody comment on
online versions? A new
Did anybody comment on this chart?
They said compete with your competitor on A. Capitalize on
so this is the way. Yeah, this is what most people do. Is they go
taking your courses too.
What's that?
They're alums, so I'm assuming some of them have taken your courses.
Oh, yeah,
So
maybe they have. That's good though. Means they remembered something, Justin. No, this is great, right? So think what's happening here is that you're saying, oh my God, we're behind the competition. We have to fix A. And then what's going on in the competitor's headquarters? They're yelling, we have to fix C. And by the time you're both done, you both look identical to one another, right? And so this is a problem, right? We end up growing alike as a result of benchmarking. Instead of saying, wait a second, how do we amplify our advantage on C, right? How do we amplify our distinctiveness? And that sometimes requires sacrifices. Youngmi Moon is a marketing professor at Harvard who I used to teach with, and she would say, if you're Ferrari and you're all about speed and design, right, and power, you don't go, oh my God, we're behind Volvo on safety. We need to make our cars more child friendly. What you say is, how do we stay the fastest, sleekest, most luxurious sports car in the world? That's who we are, right? But instead, what you see in a lot, and that's an extreme example, but you see this happening, right, where we don't amplify our strengths in many ways. And so this is an issue that happens in a lot of organizations.
In every organization with benchmarks. I mean, that is the reality of it. Whether you do it with great intention and do it like a SWOT analysis where you're actually, or if you just do it casually by searching around on websites, etc., you're still benchmarking.
You got it. And, I think one of the beauties of a company, just a couple of weeks ago, Herb Kelleher died, co-founder of Southwest. I think what Southwest did so remarkably is that, while every other airline marched lockstep in the same direction, they went a different path, right? And they refused to do some of the other things that other airlines did. And Herb Kelleher went to such an extreme that he said when he was building the company in the 70s, he refused to hire people who had worked at other airlines because he felt like they all thought the same way. He needed people who would think differently about the business. Now, the underlying psychology of this, Justin, is really interesting. It turns out that there's a psychological reason why when we benchmark, instead of just learning and adapting from those competitors, we end up copying. And the psychological phenomenon is called fixation. It's illustrated wonderfully by this person about to walk off a cliff while reading their Twitter chart. Yeah. So what happens, it turns out, is that and psychologists have shown this, when we study something closely, even though our intent when we study it is to see, well, what did people do before and what did they do wrong and how can we learn from it, we find ourselves fixated and it constrains our creativity. In a series of experiments, they've shown this. In fact, in one set of experiments, they actually showed, they asked engineering students to design a spill-proof coffee cup, an inexpensive spill-proof coffee cup. And they actually showed them a prior design and actually pointed out some flaws with that design and said, a new design should really address those flaws. And then they had some other students who were asked to do the same design challenge, but they were given no data about what had done before, no prior pictures or sketches. What did they find? The people with the blank slate were far more creative, measured along several different criteria. Moreover, though, interestingly, the people who looked at the past sketches, they fixated. They ended up emulating aspects of the old sketches, even though they were told those were flawed designs. They even emulated some of the flaws in many cases because they fixated. Time and again, psychologists have shown this, that when we study others, we study other things, it constrains our creativity. And so we obviously have to keep our eye on the competitor. We can't allow ourselves to become someone who just follows the herd. So this is a real challenge, I think, that we face, deep-rooted in human nature. I'd love for people, if you have some thoughts on how to overcome this fixation problem when you benchmark, if you want to type them in. I'm going to share 3 thoughts of my own, but then maybe when I'm done with that, Justin can share with us what some of you have, if you have any techniques for doing what I would call smarter benchmarking, if you will, to instill creativity.
There was a good note that I like from the previous benchmarking chart where they said, well, you should also consider, is A really where you want to be as a company, right? If you're going to pivot and say, let's focus where we differentiate, do we really want to be there? And if the answer is no to that, then you might have a much more significant strategic problem, but it's a good point.
It's a great point, right? It's a great point. I mean, take IKEA as an example, right? IKEA has done it a totally different way in the furniture business. Now, some would criticize the quality of their product, and they could certainly say, "Well, our quality is not where it needs to be relative to some competitors," and try to improve the quality of their product. But they focused on the quality of their overall experience, and they maybe have sacrificed a little bit in order to provide affordable furniture. It's probably not of the same quality as some of their competitors, but they've created a tremendous overall experience that is superior. And so by amplifying their strength on the experience, that's where they've succeeded. Let's talk about 3 strategies I have for overcoming this fixation problem and benchmarking in a smarter way. Then I'd love to hear some of your ideas. So the 3 ideas I have that I want to share are: look outside for inspiration, define substitutes broadly, and study failures as well as successes in your industry. So let me explain. So first, looking outside your industry. If you are in the business, you're in a business and you're saying, like, who should I study? Don't just think about studying the people within your industry. You might say, well, what am I really trying to learn about? Am I trying to learn about customer experience, how to have incredible customer satisfaction and interaction with customers? If that's where I really want to define my competitive advantage, I could look at the best in class in my industry on that, but I might end up just copying what they're doing. Or I could say, in other industries, who's best in class when it comes to customer experience? And I could go study the Ritz-Carlton. And if I did that, I might learn some incredible things about creating a great customer experience, some new things that other people in my industry aren't doing. And I can draw some lessons from outside. So the ability to reach outside, or speed is something I want to improve in my business. What could I learn about studying race car pit crews? These are extreme examples, but the notion is get outside your industry and say, who can I learn from? Don't just get locked into studying the people who you define as the industry leaders at a particular point in time. The ability to reach outside, and what happens in the mind, it turns out we do this, is when we're outside of our element, when we're finding these things that are analogous to what we're doing, but not the same, we're forced, right, to think a little differently, because we can't copy, because we're in a totally different business, say, than the Ritz-Carlton. Maybe we're in the hospital business, right? But okay, we have beds, they have beds, right? We have to house people, they have to house people. Totally different business, but there's something analogous there, but it's different enough that we can't just copy the Ritz-Carlton. But maybe we can learn some things to make our hospital stays a heck of a lot better for our patients. And we can think a lot differently.
Someone actually commented that it looked like they were at a healthcare company and they looked at Disney for their customer service. So great example.
Disney's a big one. A lot of people do this. They go down and study Disney, and it's a great example. So looking outside for inspiration is so key. The second one is defining your substitutes broadly. So let me explain here. So a lot of times what we do is we think about how do we get more customers away from our rivals and to us. We're very focused on our rivals. But we forget that often the bigger question is often, are there substitute products and services that fulfill the same human need, that compete not just with us, but with our entire product category? So let's take fitness centers, for example, right? So Gold's Gym does not just compete with LA Fitness. they compete with the fact that there's a lot of other ways people can fulfill the needs that fitness centers fulfill. So they can work out at home. They can work out at a corporate gym. They can go on a diet. They can have weight loss surgery, right? There's a whole bunch, they can run marathons, right? There's a whole bunch of things they could do to fill the same human need. And in fact, they don't have to work out at all, right? There are some people who could choose not to work out. And so what's interesting is Planet Fitness, another Bryant alum story, by the way, co-founder Mark Grundahl, a graduate in the 1980s of Bryant. Planet Fitness has managed, in an industry, by the way, fitness centers, it's an awful business. I hope none of you are suffering in this industry. It is a terrible industry in terms of profitability. Over time, it's seen tons of bankruptcies, very thin margins. Planet Fitness, who knows what will happen? Lots of companies come and go in this industry, but for quite some time, they have succeeded in this business. They've succeeded by doing it a totally different way, right? The judgment-free zone. They even run ads that make fun of bodybuilders and really fit people and say, we don't want them here because we're not a gym, we're Planet Fitness. Why would they do that? Well, what they've defined is they've said, hey, there's 80% of the people out there who have never belonged to a gym. Why are we banging our heads against the wall, right? Trying to compete and steal customers from Gold's Gym, which is where they actually started when Planet Fitness began. Why are we doing that when we're really our competitor is Chili's and Uno's in the movie theater? How do we get people to stop doing that and come to the gym? So they define their substitutes broadly. They said, well, our substitute is, not just working out at home. It's not working out at all. It's going and doing other things that are entertaining and fun. So why don't people come to gyms? And how do we solve that problem rather than solving the problem of why don't they go to us rather than Gold's? Why don't they go to gyms at all? And their CEO says, we got to figure out why we can convince them not to go to the movie theater or Chili's and instead come to the gym. So defining your substitute broadly, someone mentioned the insurance business. If you're in the insurance business, you got to be thinking about, wait, we're not just competing with other insurance companies. We're competing with Uber right now because if people don't own as many cars as they used to, then they won't need auto insurance. And so, broadly speaking, that's a substitute that we have to contend with. Very, very important to think about.
And one of the most famous ones is Southwest again. Southwest wasn't competing against airlines. They were competing against Greyhound bus. Cheap way of getting
and the car.
Yeah.
Herb Kelleher said that the way they priced in the 70s and 80s, when they began and had some success, they priced those intra-Texas routes, not according to what their competitors were pricing, but according to what it cost to drive a car from between those cities. And their goal was to be cheaper than driving a car. Defining your substitute, it's a car. How do we beat it? And they grew the entire market rather than just trying to steal customers from their rivals. And then lastly, studying failures as well as successes. We can look at a company like Keurig. They've had a tremendous amount of success. And we could study that success in the coffee business. But sometimes it's important to also recognize that while they may be a great firm, lots of great firms have their duds too. And for Keurig, it was the Keurig cold machine, an attempt to build a soda machine that was kind of like the Keurig coffee pod method. It was a total bust. They wasted tens of millions of dollars on this. It cost a lot of employees their jobs. They actually ended up rebating customers and buying back the machines. It was a total disaster. One of the reasons it was a disaster was they kind of had a hammer in search of a nail. They had a great technology, and they said, what else can we do with this technology? Instead of asking, what's the customer need, and how do we fulfill it? See, the Keurig coffee machine really fulfills the customer need around convenience and variety and speed and easy cleanup. The soda machine really didn't identify a need it was addressing. What it did is it said, well, we have a great technology. Can we do something else and sell product with this technology? Because they really didn't understand and identify a need, there was no market there, and they struggled. So, boy, there's a lot to learn, remembering that even the industry leaders fail at times. And why did they fail? And not just focus on benchmarking success. Justin, those are my ideas.
Yeah, a couple of good ones.
Did anybody chime in with any other ideas?
Sure. So one that I really like, and two people sort of submitted this, is when you're having a meeting, a strategic meeting, what have you, invite people into the meeting that maybe you didn't consider before. Internal folks, external folks, people from departments that you might not think are important to this exact problem, but they might have a new spin on it, or they might be on the front lines. Get their voice, hear their voice. And then the second was the power of focus groups, especially for smaller companies, to really try to hear your audience that way. The last person, someone commented expanded in the market, and then someone else chimed in how retail coffee expanded the market. It makes me think of like bottled water. Like bottled water wasn't a thing until we decided to bottle it up.
Yep. And coffee, of course. Yeah, it's a great example, right? And there, the key for a lot of those companies was not to steal share from the existing coffee companies, was to steal share from Maxwell House and Folgers. How to get people to go out for coffee instead of brewing it in their home, right? So great comments.
And we only have about 15 minutes left, so we'll let you kind of fly through some of these.
I'm going to hit the second mindset that I want to talk about today, and I'll tell you a quick story. A story that tells us a lot about our fundamental beliefs about creativity. U2 had some early success in the early 80s, and then they went about making the album The Unforgettable Fire. But Bono and his bandmates, they wondered, are we just going to become another kind of, pop band who does the same thing over and over? And so even though they'd only just had a little success at this point, they already decided they wanted to change their style and do some experimentation. And they hold themselves up in Slane Castle in Ireland, and they for quite some number of weeks, they ate, they lived, they played together, excluded and isolated from their families and from others, just focusing. In one crazy day, they even played naked for a whole session, trying to come up with a new style. And ultimately they did. I mean, Unforgettable Fire was kind of a break from their previous style and was a remarkably successful album. It was a rebirth, if you will. It was as if Bono said we were the same band, the same members in a whole new band in a way. But we have this image, unfortunately, that this is where creative breakthrough happens. Hold yourselves up on the top of a mountain or in a castle or in a war room at a company or an innovation hub. If we just isolate people and get them to focus and stop multitasking, that they will be creative. And yes, multitasking is counterproductive. But actually, the best creative ideas come from oscillating between focus and unfocus. Mark Twain put it best. He said, I made the great discovery that when the tank runs dry, you're only to leave it alone and it will fill up again in time, while you are asleep, also while you are at work at other things, and are quite unaware that this unconscious and profitable celebration is going on. It turns out that creative breakthroughs most of the time come about when we do intensely focus, but we also at times unfocused, gain some distance from the problem to help us achieve a breakthrough. And so just telling people to hole up in a war room and to think that over the course of 1 or 2 weeks of intense work that they can come up with a breakthrough, it's not likely. In fact, U2 didn't finish the album in the castle. They took a bit of a break. They got together again in Dublin later that summer and then finished off the album. It did incredibly well.
And they wore clothes. They wore clothes for the rest of the beginning.
So here's my creative challenge. Quickly type this in if you have the answer. A dealer in antique coins got an offer to buy a beautiful bronze coin. The coin had an emperor's head on one side and the date 544 BC stamped on the other. The dealer examined the coin, but instead of buying it, he called the police. Why? So while you're working on that or thinking about that, let's talk about this idea of achieving psychological distance. It turns out that if you gain distance from a problem, sometimes after a period of intense focus, it can help you be more creative and get a breakthrough when you've hit writer's block or mental block of some kind. And this distance can be taking a break, going for a walk, but it can be more than that. And there's actually some techniques you use to achieve distance. So there are 3 forms of distance I want to talk about: social distance, physical or cultural distance, and temporal distance. Social distance is when you imagine that someone else is tackling this problem you're facing, or you role play someone else, that you are someone else. That if you can do that, if you can step out of your own shoes or step into someone else's shoes, that can help us. The second is physical or cultural distance. If we can understand how people in different countries or cultures have tackled the same problem, or if we can just get out of our own comfort zone and visit places or industries or markets or customers that are different than the ones we usually interact with, that physical and cultural distance can spark creativity. And finally, temporal distance. If we can imagine ourselves in the future, if we can sort of fast forward a month or a year and then work backwards to where we are today, that can help spark creativity. Let me explain how. Tom and Dave Kelly talk about this travel idea as being a creative stimulant. distance literally in a physical sense, because they say when we travel, we don't just take things for granted. The day-to-day things that we take for granted, our normal commute to work, we notice. We notice everything because we're paying attention. We're in a foreign place. And all of a sudden, new ideas come to light. And we notice problems and opportunities to do things better that we never notice day to day, right? So this idea of gaining some distance like causes us to sort of shake our assumptions a little bit is really key. Let's talk
So
about
the
how we
problem
can
you
do that.
submitted, we have some answers already, and
Oh,
it is one of
did
those
anybody get
problems
it?
that, yes. So it's one of those problems that, like, at first glance, if you just answer with your gut, you might say something like a few people said, like, well, it must have been stolen or something like that. A few people said forgery, but the reason it's a forgery, I'll let you answer it because it's your question.
And the answer is that, of course, if you're 544 years before Christ, you don't know you're 544 years before Christ. So you couldn't have a coin that said 544 BC.
So a couple people got that one right.
And this comes from a series of experiments where they showed that if people got some distance from that problem in some way, by imagining someone else tackling that problem, or by imagining people far away dealing with that problem, or imagining you in the future tackling that problem, any way you could get distance from this problem, you're more likely to get it correct. Of course, one of my favorite examples of distance in a real physical and cultural sense is the Beatles going to India when they studied Eastern meditation practices. And of course, many of the great songs of the White Album emerged from that trip. It's pretty cool. But let's talk more practical about what you and I can do in our own organizations to get psychological distance. So first, social distance. We can engage in competitor role plays. Role playing the competition can be a way of stepping in someone else's shoes and thinking about issues in our industry differently. I've seen this in a number of companies. I saw this happen at Sun Life, where they did this really successfully in the insurance business. And of course, we see football teams do this all the time where they have players pretend to be the other team. In the U.S. Army, they use red teaming, where they run simulations of battles, and some soldiers play the blue team, the allies, and some soldiers role play the enemy, the red team. And so many interesting breakthroughs happen when they go through that. And finally, at IDEO, the product design firm, they use something called walking a mile in the customer's shoes. An example of this is when they were redesigning a wing of ambulatory care facility at a hospital. They actually, instead of just going and interviewing people, they actually had one of their designers pretend to have a foot injury and check himself into the ER, and then go through this whole process in the hospital as if he was a patient to see through the patient's eyes, and got some creative breakthroughs. Physical and cultural distance, travel and foreign assignments can really help. Fashion designers have been shown to be more creative if they get out of their home country and go see what people are wearing and doing in other countries. And even, virtual field trips can help us do this if we don't have the time or money to travel. Now we're seeing in elementary and high schools, kids experiencing virtual field trips through some amazing video work done by people like Discovery Education. So there's ways to actually go in and actually visit factories through these kinds of virtual field trips, believe it or not. So ways of gaining distance. And then finally, temporal distance, at Amazon, they have this incredible practice where if they've got someone thinking about a new service that they want to launch, they will ask those people sometimes to write the press release that will be issued months or even years in the future when that service is launched. Why would they do that? They want them to imagine what you're saying to the customer and how the customer is reacting. And then from writing that press release, work backward to thinking, are we doing the right thing today? And this think ahead and reason back turns out to really help them be creative. Similarly, at Royal Dutch Shell, they do a lot of scenario planning historically. It's another way of thinking about the future and envisioning different scenarios. So whether it's role-playing the competition, visiting a foreign market, or thinking ahead and reasoning back in some way, these are ways we can sort of challenge our mindsets and achieve some distance and be more creative. I'll close out with just a couple of closing thoughts about attitude, and then take a couple of questions. I had the opportunity to interview Ed Catmull for this book. He's a longtime head of president of Pixar and then Disney Pixar. And he talks about this idea that ugly babies are the key to Pixar's success. Every movie starts out as suck, and we hope to get it to not suck. He says the key to creativity is to being willing to get your ideas out there and let people call your baby ugly. don't wait and hide your ideas. Get feedback early and often, because that's the key. That attitude is so important.
I love that
Krista
one.
Quarles, I love it too, and it's very similar to Krista Quarles, who's the CEO at Open Table, the company that you can reserve restaurant reservations on an app on your phone so easily. She has this mantra: early, often, ugly. It's okay. It doesn't have to be perfect. No amount of ugly truth scares me. It's just information to make a decision. Early, often, and ugly. I want to see those ideas. So this attitude of getting feedback early and iterating is so key to the creative process, I think. And lastly, Maria Montessori. If you think about when we're leading others, what's our role? She says, to stimulate life, leaving it then free to develop, to unfold. Herein lies the first task of the teacher. I think we could replace the word teacher with leader there. In many ways, that's the job of the leader. It's not to come up with all the great ideas, but to stimulate in others the new ideas, to get them thinking differently. And if you can do that, if you can create the environment, then that's so powerful. Most organizations don't have a people problem. They have a situation problem. They don't lack creative people. They've got a situation that's stifling those people's creativity. And that's our job, to try to figure out how to unlock it in some way. So with that, Justin, I'll turn it back over to you. If anybody has any questions they want to type into you, and you're willing to share.
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes left. If anyone wants to, people are excited, thanking you. I mean, for me, it just really resonates. And at my company, we're really pushing to have better creative meetings with clients, and it makes it more fun. It's a scary balance, going back to your first slide, of these two worlds of, yes, we want creativity, but do we want a bunch of weirdos in here? And I think, especially corporate America, we struggle with that as business, but it should, in theory, make it way more fun. You just have to be accepting of ideas and not afraid of them.
That's right. That's right.
So, no mention of findings in contemporary and progressive neuroscience. Someone asked about neuroscience. Flow creativity does not emerge from the brain. But the mind-body aligned through mindfulness, meditation, elite athletes. Any stories around that? So flow, the idea of getting in a rhythm or flow, mindfulness, meditation.
I don't get into meditation per se, but I do in the book. I look, like I did with the story about fixation. In each of these mindsets, I explore the psychology behind why we struggle with some of these things. So, the book is definitely well steeped in cognitive and social psychology, and in a few cases it delves into some of the neuroscience. But definitely it's the understanding the psychological barriers, what's embedded in human nature or in the way teams work that makes it difficult for us at times. So I think, and I report on some really cool experiments, I think, that people have done in each chapter to try to delve into that.
I mean, I think like the reality is there's no doubt that some of these there's a lot of things that work. That's the reality of it. But a lot of times we block those things and we don't let people have their own ideas or try their own things, and we all work differently as humans. So if one person needs to take a break during a meeting and meditate to find their space, you should probably let them. So I think there's just that innate difference among humans as well.
Yeah. So, and some of it, there's a lot of work on walking, that physical exercise somehow physiologically, changes the brain and affects our brain and helps us to be more creative. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, a lot of people chiming in. It seems like this might be from a similar person, but like a lot of corporate America, and we just saw it with the NFL and its hirings, it is a lot of older school white men that sort of, they're the leaders or they're the presumed leaders at organizations, and it can be difficult to cut into that. So,
well, what's interesting is diversity important because we know that heterogeneity in a team leads to more cognitive diversity and more, a wider range of ideas. However, we also know diversity is not sufficient. In other words, you need to have it. I mean, it's necessary, but not sufficient. Excuse me, is what I meant to say. Meaning, you can have teams you build where they look diverse, they are diverse, but if they're not led well, if you don't build the right culture within that team, you still run into problems. And so it's necessary, but not sufficient. So you got to do it, but then you got to do something with it, which is key.
segues into this last comment, which I really like, and it sounds like it's someone that's maybe a mid-level manager. Great presentation, but how do we get more upper-level folks, like the decision makers at the company? How do we get them to take these ideas, address the mindsets, and hit them head on? And that goes into you with this book. What do you want organizations to be able to do with it, and how can someone that's not at the top make progress with it?
Yeah, so I would say this. Obviously, I'd like to have some impact on the people at the top. I hope that my ideas will take root. But what I say to the people who aren't at the top is, you will be more persuasive and have more influence if you show them rather than you tell them. Show them. In other words, take some of these ideas, take your own team, do it, get some results, and then show them results. Unless you show them results, it's unlikely that if you don't have authority, you're gonna be able to persuade just through words. And so I'm a big believer in this idea of small wins. Find a small project, find a small win, demonstrate that victory, prove it, and you will influence people and persuade them far more effectively than if you try to lecture them about the virtues of doing it a different way.
Cool. Well, that's all the time we have. So that was awesome for me. I just finished the book, so good to see you. You can go to alumni.bryant.edu to check out some upcoming events. Yeah, that was great.
Thanks, everybody. And you're welcome to hit me up on Twitter or Facebook. Twitter is Michael A. Roberto, and Facebook is Professor Michael Roberto. Love to hear your comments or interact. Please do. I'd love to do that, continue the conversation, and hopefully I'll see some of you at alumni events in the near future. Thanks for your support of Bryant, for all you do for our students, and we hope, of course, to help you in any way we can. And one of those ways at alumni events is both sharing some ideas with you, but also bringing you together to network with one another. So hope to see many of you soon. And of course, if you're ever back on campus, please come by and visit. Thanks, Justin, for all the great work on this webinar. Appreciate it, everybody.